Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at Sportflics football cards, 1994 and 1995. Now, this was kind of a new discovery for us. We hadn't really had much of a history of lenticular cards in football. We'd had some Kellogg's cards in the 70s, and really maybe some Slurpee cards here and there. Other than that, there was basically nothing. But the company that created Sportflics was Score Pinnacle, and they had actually started out as a lenticular card, a novelty card manufacturer. So through the 70s and the 80s, they'd been making these lenticular cards for various companies, and by 1986, they decided that it was time for them to go full-blown, making full-blown card sets of baseball. And the cards they came up were novelty cards based on the lenticular card design that they had, or the lenticular concept that they'd been making, but they forgot the design component. They figured that the lenticular design itself would work well for a complete set and insert sets and specialty sets and all sorts of weird sets. And they were pretty optimistic, but they were going to have to find ways to really earn their keep down the road, because the idea itself is nice, but it's a gimmick. So by 1988, they decided they needed to make a more of a normal card. But even at that, they were pretty innovative at what they made. But since it was the same company, they did put as inserts in every single pack a miniature lenticular card, a miniature Sportflic card that was a trivia card or some sort of information card. And they did that in 88, 89, 90. It became a trend in Score. It became a critical part, or a fundamental part, of opening packs of Score baseball. And in 1989, the football market was wide open. It was basically sleepy. There was Topps in 88 with a half-size card set that was just Topps. Fleer was making some semi-cards, but there really wasn't anything going on. So if you only collected football cards, you had no idea what was going on. And Score stepped into this space where there was nothing, and along with Pro Set, basically blew the doors off of anybody who hadn't been collecting baseball. And their 1989 Score set was revolutionary in many different ways. And one of the ways for football card collectors was they had these little miniature lenticular cards. Like I said, there'd been some lenticular cards in football, but hardly anything at all. So every single pack of Score came with a little trivia card for one of each of the football teams. And on the front of the card, it had the two-phase lenticular card approach. So you had a football helmet, and then you had the team name, and it was really cool. And it worked well because it was a miniature little insert in every single pack. So the fact that there wasn't a lot of diversity to it was perfectly fine. And it was perfect for kids. And in 1990, they continued that with Super Bowl trivia. So it was a fun thing, but it really wasn't something that worked too well with football, to the point where in 1991, they stopped doing this. Now in baseball, they had been making their main Sportflics set from 1986 all the way through 1990, but they didn't continue it beyond. It just didn't have a place in the market space. Even though for Score, they continued to make the little trivia cards, and through 1992, those would continue to exist. But past 1992, there was no place for Sportflics in sports. But it wouldn't last that long, because the 90s was a pretty active event, and by 1993 it was clear that you were going to need to do something interesting. You were going to need to be coming up with interesting ideas here and there, and for Score, they decided to fall back on Sportflics. Now, before I go on, let me just explain very basically what Sportflics is, or more correctly, what lenticular card design is. Lenticular cards are a plastic surface and then a card behind. And the card has the image on it, and the image is a bunch of it's basically you take two images and you divide it up into a bunch of little strips, and then you lace them together. And you can lace them together on a flat surface, or you can layer them into a surface, but basically you have the images embedded, and then you have the plastic surface, which has a bunch of little ridges, and those ridges have different angles for the prismatic passing of light. So depending on the direction that each of the faces is directed, the light that passes through that your eye can see, you'll see a different, either the surface on the back or the surfaces inside the plastic. Wherever the image is, you'll see different little pieces of image that will come through. Kind of like the way that the light works on a brushed metal surface, where light will reflect off in a certain direction. Here they're doing it with the actual prismatic structure of the plastic on the front of the card. So that's the idea. And it's really easy to do that with two images. So you have two images where you either see part of one image in each one of these little facets, or you see the other image. And that's what most of Sportflics was. It was two images, or three images, or four images, and you transition from one to the other. You can use it to use a bunch of little micro images and create kind of a 3D effect. And this was something that Kellogg's used to do in the 70s and early 80s. But with Sportflics, they didn't really tend to do that too much. They tried to stay with single images because that way a collector can look at one image and then they can maybe see another player or another version of the shot of the player. So you have one card that has two images of the same player. And that's usually what they did with Sportflics. So in 1994, when Sportflics was relaunched as a new Score Pinnacle Brands card set, to add to the array of different cards that they had to sell and to interest people, they did it as a two-phase, which is what most of the Sportflics in the 80s in baseball had been, and it's what all of the little special tiles had been through the years. Here they did a full bleed card design for their 94 cards, and that was the thing for 1994. Everybody went with no borders, or almost everybody did, and here I gotta give them credit. They actually tended to choose pretty good images for these cards, so the cards read really well. And you had two images that could be, it looks like a progression of the play, or two totally different shots, however they wanted to do it. But the images did tend to come out really well. Again, in the 1980s, this was a problem that they had a rough time with, of getting one really good shot. Here in 1994, they pulled it off. And they had deep, rich colors that looked good. The card design was just basically stripped down one side, and you had two footballs down at the bottom, one kind of jumping back and forth. You had just the last name, and it would expand. So the last name actually was a full progression, even though the image was either or. And then up at the top you have Sportflics in 1994, and they had the team logo, or the helmet, and then it transitioned to a team kind of helmet logo kind of a thing. So most of it was two-phase with this interesting name that was expanding down over on the side. Otherwise, it actually looked really good. It really did. The card back, on the other hand, was kind of a mess of a 1990, kind of a Stadium Club design and a Pinnacle design kind of thrown together. Kind of weird, but this wasn't the kind of card that you got in order to learn about the player. It was just kind of there on the back, and it worked. The rookies, on the other hand, were a college shot of the player, and then the transition was to the helmet, mainly a helmet of the team that drafted him, and then a couple of other helmets kind of thrown in there. They had the player name on the side, but you'll notice here they have the expanding last name, like the main cards, but they also have the first name, which is really good because you're not familiar with these guys. You're learning about them. So props to them for thinking that all the way through. And then they have a weird kind of stat kind of thing down at the bottom, which is kind of, whatever. They put something on there. So these cards are kind of a mess, but at least the transition from the player to the helmet, that does actually look pretty cool. And then they did have one subset, which was their Starflix set. And here they actually have a 3D effect. So they really did maximize these cards, and it looks really good. So the player and all of the accoutrements are up on the front plane, and then you have a very effective 3D effect on the card back. Looks really great. And I'm glad that they didn't try anything too ostentatious. This is a card set where they did everything just right enough so that it comes through well. The cards may not be the most amazing cards, but for Sportflics, this was absolutely amazing. They really pulled off something they'd never been able to do before. So that break that they made from 1990 through 94 or 92, 94, wherever you want to look at it, it gave them the ability to really get the card technology to read beautifully for their cards. And for football, this was basically the inauguration. So these cards came out well. Now they are thick. They didn't come too many cards per pack, so they weren't cheap. And it was still a gimmick, so it wasn't a great thriving market, but it was a good enough market that it was one of the different brands that we were definitely willing to sell, albeit more for kids. That's really where this was at. But it was 1994, and you needed to have more than just an interesting card. And what Pinnacle was doing at this time was they were doing artist-proof cards. And so here they had a little gold artist-proof logo that was stuck right on. It wasn't integrated in. It was just a tile right on the outside of the card, and it wasn't integrated in, so they had that parallel. And the cards were kind of tough to get, so it was an interesting enough parallel to go with. Kind of cool. But they also did 2 insert sets. One of them was Rookie Rivalry. And this is 2 players that are basically the same position. That's pretty much what they like to do with these cards. And they use the 2 phase to go between one rookie and the other. And they like to get these rookies actually in their NFL uniforms. So now they're starting to look like pros. And for some players, like with Isaac Bruce, this is actually his only rookie card. The card back, though, interestingly, has them flipped over. So they have one on one side, one is reversed like a playing card. But on the front, there's a top and a bottom, and they're oriented the same way. So weird that they did that. Kind of throws me off. But they did not do an artist-proof parallel of this. These only come just in this way. But down at the bottom, they do have the expanding text for obviously not for the player name, it's for the Rookie Rivalry text. And they did something similar with their head-to-head insert set, where this time it's a horizontal card, and they have the really upfront shots of the 2 players facing each other, offense and defense, and then that it flips over to an expanded out shot of smaller shots of the player coming in either side, and then it's the names down at the bottom that expand, kind of like in the main set. These cards they're bolder, they read a lot better than the rookies. They're not as interesting, though, as the rookie cards are. But those were the 2 insert sets that they made, and so that is what they did for 1994. They didn't do anything else that was of any note. However, they did do some promos. You may run into some of these cards that have a notch cut on the side. That's what the promos were for 1994. That's what they did here, what they did in Pinnacle. So if you find one with a notch, understand that is a promo card. But they also did some specialty cards that they gave away at various events, starting with the Super Bowl cards, these are actually technically not called Sportflics. These are called Score, even though they're Sportflic design, but they say Score on them. And this is a bunch of cards. Sometimes it's 2 shots of the same player. Sometimes it's 2 players, like here with Reggie Brooks and Jerome Bettis. But it's a small set, and on the card backs, they have SB on either side of the number for the player. So that was a special set they had. There's also another special set which has Terry Kirby and it has Leonard Russell. That's separate from the Super Bowl cards. And so for 1994, that's what they did. And they had the opportunity to make another set in 1995. But an important note is they had a problem with the names. And I don't know, at this point, I don't know if this was part of the divorce of the 2 owners of Score that had happened in 1993, and whether there was a conflict of the naming rights, who owned what. Regardless, for 1995, they changed the name from Sportflix with a CS to Sportflix with an X at the end. So that's what Sportflix would be moving forward. And for the 1995 card design, they did a little bit more with the card design itself. So it's a little bit more slick, but it's not as interesting. The cards don't tend to read as well. Some of them are more washed out. The image selection is not as good. And even though the design itself on the 94 card was kind of gimmicky, it was bold and strong. In 1995, not quite the same. And the card back is better designed and not as interesting. It's what it is. They made a better card, and they failed to make as interesting of a card, which is just kind of weird. These cards do come with the artist proof, but in 1995 they did have a couple of new teams. They had the expansion teams of the Panthers and the Jaguars, who had not taken the field yet, but they did have shots of the players in their new uniforms. But since they didn't have a lot of images, the second phase was the new team helmet and the name. So it was kind of advertising the new teams, which was kind of what everybody was doing. It was a big celebration of the 2 upcoming teams. So for those cards, they have kind of like the rookies in the previous year, they have the player and then they have the helmet. That's the two phase they go with. The rookies, on the other hand, they made a really cool effect. It's an ugly effect, but it's a cool effect, where here they don't have the 3D effect. Instead, they have this color pattern that has an amazing range of passage of the color. This is a lot more impressive than the expanding names in 1994. So the 95 cards, technologically, these are very, very, very impressive cards. So whether you think the cards look better or not, they are better on a technical level. And then they also have award winners, or winners from the 1994 season, as their subset here in this card set. And here this is full bleed. They have two images from whatever it's related to. In Jerry Rice, in this case, this is related to the Super Bowl. So this was the subset that they went with. Again, all of these cards come with the two phases. And then you got the checklist cards with either an AFC player or an NFC player, depending on which of the two conferences the checklist is related to. And it's two phases of each player. But then there's also an AFC and NFC card checklist at the end, which is for all their insert cards, the chase cards. And so here, since it's both conferences are showing on this card, on the front they have Jerry Rice or they have Junior Seau, which is eerily reminiscent of the Super Bowl. And so instead of two phases of the same player, it's two players crossed on the card, which still they look really good. And so that was basically what they did for the set. Now they did do some interesting insert sets here, starting off with Pro Motion. Now this is a really cool effect where they start off with the shot of the player and then he morphs into the helmet. It's a weird thing to look at, and so the strongest phases that you see are either the player or the helmet. That's mostly what you see, which is good because you don't want to see the halfway point. It's an interesting effect. It doesn't look, it's a fun idea they came up with. This is, to me, not the kind of card that you really look at as much as you put the set together and you have it out there to kind of look at from a distance, but you don't really want to explore these cards too much. Then they had their head-to-head set, but here they called it man-to-man. And so in this case, instead of focusing on offense and defense the way that they had the previous year, here it's done differently, and the cards aren't quite as effective because they wanted to go with the 3D effect. But it's kind of busy, and the 3D effect doesn't really come out too well. But it is an interesting card set, and not worrying about the technology, the cards do look kind of interesting. They look really good. So I do like the cards. I wish that the effect had come through better, but it doesn't really need to. But then they got Rolling Thunder, and the Rolling Thunder set, these cards, it's kind of eerie how effective this comes out, because it's not really a 3D effect, but it has these two circles that are spinning, and that effect is very, very, very strong, which is great. But I got to give it to their rookie insert set, because this pulls off something that it's still mesmerizing. I understand how it works and it makes perfect sense, but to see it is just, it's surreal, because these are clear cards, they're acetate cards, so you can see through them. But when you go from one image to the other, you go from part of the image which is exposed to it disappears, completely disappears. You can see through the card. So parts of the player that don't get replaced by an image from the other phase, those just flat out disappear to a clear card. It is such an impressive effect. I love it. This is a card that really does mesmerize me. It's a card I spend a lot of time looking at because it's amazing that it works. That's kind of the way that I see it. But since I talked about the promo cards in 94, I will note that on the promo cards for 95, you can tell them because they have promo written down at the bottom. So that's the main way you can tell. But they also did another promo set, which was Pride of Texas. And this is 4 players from 3 pro teams in Texas. You have Michael Irvin of the Cowboys, you have Gary Brown of the Oilers, and then you have both Mike Modano and Darian Hatcher of the fairly recent to the neighborhood Dallas Stars. And so that set was done as a complete set. Just 4 cards, and you may run into those, but that was the end of Sportflics in football. They only had the 2 years. For 1996, they didn't have anything to come out with, but they needed to go into a more formal space. 1994 and 1995, this kind of a gimmick would work really well. And it was nice to see the Sportflics cards grow up. I think they came out well, and I'm glad that in football, this is all we had, because that meant that for football, all the Sportflics cards look good. We didn't have to worry about the crap from the 1980s. It was really good. And as much as I'd like to see them come back, I'm not sure why there would be any reason to. The card market certainly wouldn't work for it. Or in a way, it might be an opportunity for a corner of the market for kids. So maybe that would work. But regardless, it is fun to have these here in this time where they fit. It made sense. They look good. It's really fun. And this is definitely one of those areas where it's fun for kids because these cards are really cool. That's but other than that, there's basically nothing else to talk about except for in baseball. So that's going to be a whole nother area that I'm going to be exploring. But this is a fun little chapter here. I hope that you enjoyed seeing these, and if this is something that seems kind of interesting, definitely check them out because they're fun. They're really fun. That's really the key to these cards. So other than that, if you haven't checked out my other videos, definitely do so. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. And thank you very much for watching.